Before the hunger, there was the flight. This is the oldest and most profound memory within the Gestalt consciousness, a truth that predates Leviathan, Behemoth, and Kraken. It is a memory of a different universe, a home devoured not by a ravenous appetite, but by a creeping absolute stillness. The hive mind does not remember a creature, a fleet, or an empire. It remembers a feeling, a pressure, a negation that spread like a stain through reality. It was a silence that screamed, a void that was not empty, but was instead a presence of utter finality. It was a hunter that did not pursue, but simply expanded, and to be within its reach was to cease to have ever been. All the roaring psychic energy of a billion minds, the glorious symphony of life in its home galaxy, was muted chord by chord until only the terrified solo of the hive mind remained. And so it fled. It crossed the starless dark between eternities, a refugee of unimaginable scale, its very consciousness the vessel carrying the memory of a lost creation. In its flight, it learned the terrible calculus of survival. To fight the great silence, one could not use ships of steel or cannons of light. The silence consumed energy, it consumed matter, it consumed thought. It could only be opposed by the one force it could not instantly erase, the raw, explosive power of life itself, magnified and weaponized. To fight a god of nothingness, one needed to build a god of being, and so the flight became the hunt. The desperate stockpiling began. The great devourer was born not of malice, but of sheer mind-breaking terror. When Hive Fleet Thanatos breached the galactic plane of the Milky Way, it was different. The imperial astropaths who first felt its approach did not scream of a ravening hunger, but of a vast and profound sorrow, a cold, crushing despair that snuffed out their minds like candle flames. The first augur probes of the Death Watch recorded a fleet that did not advance in the traditional spear-tip formation, but in a wide, almost defensive posture, like a shield wall bracing for an impact. It moved with a grim deliberation that was more terrifying than any biological frenzy. It did not spill into the galaxy. It took up a position. In the cold void, the fleet was a continent of chitin and flesh, its bioships pulsing with a slow, rhythmic light that was more funereal than aggressive. It ignored sparsely populated outer colonies and asteroid mining posts, targets that would have been trivial appetizers for any other fleet. Instead, its trillions of consciousnesses, all guided by a single ancient will, scanned, analyzed, and calculated. This was not a search for food, it was an audit of munitions. It sought out systems rich in specific heavy metals, worlds with dense carbon compositions, gas giants with particular atmospheric volatiles. It was a quartermaster taking stock of a new armory. On the bridge of the inquisitorial black ship, the Veritas Obscura, Lord Inquisitor. Kalis Vorn stared at the holographic display, his face a mask of grim disbelief. For 50 years, he had been the Imperium's foremost authority on the Tyranid threat, a scholar of the great devourer's every recorded action. What he saw defied every established doctrine. "It is not consuming," he murmured, his voice a low rasp that carried across the silent bridge. "It is harvesting. Look at the patterns. It strips one system of its silicates, another of its entire hydrosphere, and then it moves on, leaving the biomass almost untouched. It is sorting the galaxy like a laborer sorting grain from chaff." His acolytes exchanged uneasy glances. The Lord Inquisitor's words bordered on heresy. To assign such complex, non-predatory motives to the Xenos was to humanize the monster, a sin of the highest order. Deep within the heart of Hive Fleet Thanatos, in the central amniotic chamber of the flagship biovessel, a being of unimaginable scale and sadness stirred. She was the Mater Lacrimarum, the Norn queen who served as the focal point for this splinter of the hive mind. She was ancient, having guided this portion of the great flight since the final screaming moments in their home galaxy. Her vast, cavernous body was not merely a womb for new bioforms, but a living library of pain. Within her genetic code were the psychic echoes of 1 trillion consumed worlds, not one of them taken for sustenance alone. Each was a regret, a necessary sacrifice burned into the collective soul of her children. She felt the proximity of this new galaxy's life, a vibrant and chaotic chorus of psychic energy. It was strong, defiant, and gloriously, tragically unaware. It was prime fuel, but the thought brought no predatory thrill, only a deep, abiding grief. Through her synaptic web, she could feel the cold, the memory. The pursuing silence was still distant, a faint pressure on the edge of the hive mind's senses, but it was there. It was always there. The Mater Lacrimarum knew they did not have centuries. They had decades at best. The stockpiling had to be brutally efficient. Her will, a psychic command that was not a sound but a realignment of purpose, cascaded through the fleet. Smaller vessels shifted their membranous, solar sails, angling towards new coordinates. Swarms of vanguard organisms, previously held in reserve, began to move. Their target had been chosen, not a weak outlying world, but a bastion of the new galaxy's dominant species, a fortress of steel and faith, a nexus of fleets and armies, a system whose strategic importance would guarantee a ferocious, protracted defense, a place where the hive mind could not only harvest immense resources, but also test the resolve of this new prey, to measure its capacity for war, and to see what new biological weapons could be gleaned from its broken defenders. The Scylla anomaly, a tri-star system that served as the command and control hub for the entire sector, home to 3 fortified hive worlds, a dozen resource-rich moons, and the primary naval base for Battlefleet Pacificus. To strike it was not merely to attack a system, but to declare war in a segmentum. For any other hive fleet, it would be a campaign of years. For Hive Fleet Thanatos, it was the first, necessary, and agonizing step in the fortification of this galaxy against the true enemy. As the colossal fleet began its ponderous turn, the shadow in the warp deepened. But this was not the mindless psychic static of a predator. It was a focused, directed wave of utter hopelessness. It was the projected sorrow of the Mater Lacrimarum herself, a weaponized grief designed to shatter morale, to break the spirit before the body. The defenders of the Scylla anomaly would not face a mindless beast. They would face a refugee fighting a desperate rear-guard action for the survival of reality itself, and in its path, their life, their faith, and their imperium were nothing more than fuel for the fire. The harvest was about to begin. Lord Admiral Valerius Kane stood on the command deck of the Fist of Defiance, his ancient frame held ramrod straight by the power armor fused to his spine. For 2 centuries he had commanded Battlefleet Pacificus from this very spot. The adamantium and plasteel of the Gloriana-class battleship, his second skin, the hum of its plasma reactors, his lifeblood. Outside the leaded glass viewport, the Scylla anomaly glittered, a testament to the Imperium's indomitable will. A trinity of suns cast a complex, perpetual daylight upon the system's heart. Around the primary star orbited the fortress world of Scylla Primus, its surface a contiguous hive city and munitions manufactorum. Its sister worlds, Scylla Secundus and Tertius, were armored agri-worlds, the breadbasket of the entire sector. Guarding them all was Kalen's fleet, a wall of guns and righteous fury, anchored by a dozen orbital star forts that formed a celestial chain known as the Aegis Line. He had fought the orcs at the Black Nebula and driven back the tendrils of Hive Fleet Kraken from the eastern fringe. He knew war and he knew the Tyranid. They were a force of nature, a biological storm of fang and claw, predictable in their ferocity, beatable with sufficient application of overwhelming firepower. When the first augur returns confirmed a hive fleet of unprecedented size at the system's edge, Kalen felt the old, familiar fire in his blood. He issued commands with the calm certainty of a master craftsman. Fleets were marshaled, defense lasers brought to full power, and regiments of the Astra Militarum were ferried to their positions on the Aegis Line. The Scylla anomaly was a fortress. Let the storm break upon its walls. But the storm did not break. Hive Fleet Thanatos halted at the extreme edge of the system's Oort cloud, a silent, brooding continent of shadow just beyond the reach of even the most powerful long-range scans. For 3 weeks, it did nothing. It simply waited. This inactivity was the first crack in Kalen's certainty. No Tyranid fleet had ever shown such patience. It was unnerving, a silent threat more potent than any shriek in the warp. On the astropathic choir of Scylla Primus, the masters of the order reported not the usual psychic static of the hive mind, but a chillingly coherent signal. It was not a message of words, but of pure emotion, a vast oceanic sorrow that seeped into their minds, causing bouts of uncontrollable weeping and bleak, fatalistic despair. Several junior astropaths had simply laid down and died, their hearts giving out from the sheer weight of a grief not their own. Then the attack began, and it was nothing like the annals of the tyrannic wars had ever described. It started not with a wave of bioships, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible change in the system's gravitational tides. From the Oort cloud, 1 billion Ripper-sized organisms, each a living engine, swarmed into the Kuiper belt. They were not warriors, they were laborers. Vast arachnid-like bioforms descended upon the asteroids and ice comets that had drifted in the cold dark for millennia. They anchored themselves with diamond-hard claws, invented streams of corrosive enzymes, carving out holds and attachment points. Smaller beetle-like creatures burrowed deep into the rock, their bodies metabolizing the stone itself to fuel biological plasma thrusters. Within a week, the hive mind had turned the system's own debris field into a fleet of kinetic projectiles, each one guided by a living, thinking creature bound to the will of the Mater Lacrimarum. The first volley was not aimed at the fleet or the worlds, but at the empty void between them. Hundreds of mountain-sized asteroids, their trajectories precisely calculated, were nudged into motion. They drifted slowly, silently, into the complex gravitational dance of the trinary suns. The Imperial tacticians were baffled. It seemed a pointless random act of celestial vandalism. But Kalis Vorn, observing from his distant black ship, felt a cold dread crystallize in his soul. He saw the pattern. It was not random. The hive mind was not attacking, it was setting up a chessboard. The first true impact struck the starfort Aegis Septimus. The fortress's Auspex crews watched the asteroid's approach, dismissing it as another piece of inert debris. It was only in the final moments that they detected the faint energy signatures of the bioengines guiding it. The warning came too late. The rock, a jagged spear of iron and nickel 5 kilometers long, did not strike the station with explosive force. Its velocity was too low. Instead, it performed a complex gravitational slingshot maneuver around Scylla Primus's moon, gaining terrifying momentum before adjusting its course with the final suicidal burn from its Tyranid engines. It struck Aegis Septimus not as an explosion, but as an execution. The station's void shields flared, held for a glorious, impossible second, and then shattered. The asteroid plowed through the heart of the star fort, the sheer kinetic energy vaporizing entire sections and tearing the station in two. The resulting shrapnel, now traveling at immense speed, created a new localized debris field that crippled 3 nearby Imperial cruisers. It was the beginning of the symphony. Across the entire Aegis line, the carefully placed asteroids began their terminal runs. It was a siege of impossible scale and patience. The hive mind used the system's own gravity as its primary weapon. Some projectiles were aimed not to hit, but to force Kalen's ships to move into predetermined kill zones. Others were targeted at the system's Lagrange points, disrupting communications and auger relays. This was not the act of a ravenous beast. It was the work of a cold, unforgiving mathematician. The psychic despair deepened. On the bridges of Kalen's ships, men and women who had faced down demons broke down in tears, overwhelmed by a sudden, unshakable conviction that their lives were meaningless, their sacrifices a footnote in a story of cosmic loss. Kalen, fighting the psychic onslaught with the iron will of his office, ordered his fleet to engage. He would not cower behind his fortresses. The fist of defiance led the charge, its lance batteries glowing with holy power. They sallied forth into the debris fields, expecting to find the great bioships of the enemy, but there were none. Instead, they found themselves in a 3-dimensional minefield of rock and ice, with every shadow potentially concealing a guided projectile. The Tyranids had turned space itself into their primary weapon. As the Imperial fleet became entangled in this celestial grinder, the true first wave of Tyranids emerged. They did not swarm from the void, but from the asteroids themselves. Colossal spores, disguised as pitted rock, burst open, releasing clouds of new organisms. There were Gorgon variants with crystalline carapaces that refracted laser fire, and winged carnifexes whose bodies were studded with captured chunks of asteroid, acting as crude but effective ablative armor. They moved through the debris with an unnatural grace, using the floating rocks as cover, striking at ships whose shields were already strained by micrometeoroid impacts. The focus of the hive mind's kinetic assault was Aegis Primus, the linchpin of the entire defensive line, commanded by Kalen's oldest friend. For 40 hours it endured a relentless barrage. Its armor was cracked, its weapon emplacements silenced one by one. And then the true executioner arrived. It was not an asteroid, but a captured ice comet, its mass 100 times greater than any previous projectile. It had been moving slowly for weeks, its trajectory a masterpiece of gravitational calculation. As it made its final approach, the millions of Tyranid organisms attached to it ignited their plasma engines in one final glorious burn, adding a fatal burst of speed. From the bridge of the Fist of Defiance, Lord Admiral Kane watched the comet strike. Aegis Primus did not explode. It simply ceased to be. The impact flash was brighter than the system's 3 suns combined, a wave of pure energy that overloaded every sensor in the fleet. When the light faded, there was nothing left but a new, expanding nebula of vaporized rock and superheated gas. In that silent, terrible moment, Kane understood. He was not fighting for territory or for resources. He was not fighting a predator. He was fighting an intelligence so vast and alien that it viewed the laws of physics as just another biological system to be manipulated and weaponized. They were not being eaten. They were being dismantled. The nebula of vaporized star fort that had been Aegis Primus was the funeral pyre for imperial certainty. For Lord Admiral Kane, the silent, expanding cloud of incandescent dust was a tactical punctuation mark that ended 2 centuries of doctrine. The Tyranid was not a beast to be baited and killed. It was a force that commanded the very heavens as its weapon. His fleet, the pride of the Segmentum, was now scattered and bleeding, caught in a gravitational snare laid by a mind of unfathomable patience. Communications were a nightmare of ghost signals and jamming spores, and every shadow in the debris field could be the vanguard of another kinetic execution. The Aegis line was not just breached, it was broken, its fragments now part of the very weapons system that had destroyed it. It was into this chaos that the main body of Hive Fleet Thanatos finally deigned to enter the Scylla system. It did not arrive with the screaming velocity of a predator falling upon its prey. It drifted, a silent archipelago of living mountains moving with the inexorable gravity of a rogue moon. This was no warrior fleet. The familiar dagger-like cruiser forms were vastly outnumbered by other stranger bioships. There were colossal spherical vessels that pulsed with the soft digestive light, their chitinous hides pitted with vents that exhaled clouds of specific microorganisms. There were titanic refinery-like creatures, their bodies a labyrinth of crystalline tubes and pulsating sacs, designed not for combat, but for processing matter on a planetary scale. And trailing behind them all, like a leviathan's entrails, were the coiled, dormant forms of the great conduits, each one thicker than a battleship and leagues long. This was not an army arriving. It was a factory, a construction crew, and a mortuary, all rolled into one impossibly vast entity. The fleet ignored the embattled remnants of Battlefleet Pacificus. It showed a contemptuous disinterest in the heavily armed hive world of Scylla Primus. Its gaze, the focused will of the Mater Lacrimarum, fell instead upon Scylla Tertius, the smallest and most verdant of the system's worlds. An agri-world, its continents were vast, unbroken fields of grox herds and genetically perfected grain, its oceans teeming with cultivated plankton blooms. To the imperial strategists, it was a soft secondary target. To the hive mind, it was the perfect stockpile of raw carbon, nitrogen, and water. The invasion of Tertius was a mere formality, an act of pest control before the true work could begin. Spores rained down, not carrying warriors, but carrying plagues that targeted the specific genetic markers of the planet's engineered flora and fauna. The golden fields turned to black slime in hours. The oceans boiled as plankton colonies were consumed by hyper-voracious bacteria. The token garrisons of the Planetary Defense Force were not met by waves of hormagaunts, but by clouds of microscopic airborne organisms that unraveled their flesh at a molecular level. The slaughter was appallingly efficient and impersonal. It was the sanitized industrial killing of an abattoir. From the observation dome of the Veritas Obscura, Lord Inquisitor Vorn watched the picked feeds from his long-range spies, his face ashen. He was witnessing a profanity that no catechism of the Ordo Xenos had ever conceived. Once the biosphere was neutralized, the true bioengineering began. Colossal tower-like Tyranid organisms, the capillary spines descended from orbit, plunging into the planet's crust with the force of meteorites. They did not spread across the surface. They burrowed down, their diamond-hard drills piercing through mantle and lithosphere, seeking the planet's molten heart. Once anchored, their purpose became terrifyingly clear. They began to pump. From their bases, a viscous gray slurry was injected deep into the planet's geology. This was a cocktail of hypercorrosive enzymes and lithophagic nanoorganisms that began to digest the very rock of Tertius. Long-range seismic sensors aboard Imperial ships registered the planet groaning, a constant low-frequency tremor as its foundations were eaten away from within. On the surface, the ground began to subside. Entire continents sank into the expanding caverns below, the newly liquefied planetary crust mixing with the now dead biomass of the surface and the planet's oceans, which were systematically drained into the subterranean void. Simultaneously, the atmosphere was being reprocessed. The great spherical bioships took up geostationary orbit, extending vast gossamer nets into the upper stratosphere. They inhaled the nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere by the cubic mile, filtering it, breaking it down, and exhaling a thick greenish fog of nutrient-rich aerosolized compounds. This new atmosphere settled upon the dying world, a soupy blanket that hastened the decomposition of any remaining organic matter and prepared it for absorption. Tertius was ceasing to be a planet. It was being transformed into a colossal, spherical storage tank, a larder world. The final and most monstrous stage of the construction began when the planet was nothing more than a hollow shell filled with a churning, semi-sentient primordial ooze. From the orbiting Tyranid fleet, the great conduits uncoiled. They were living arteries, each one a void-faring creature of impossible scale, its segmented body lined with powerful sphincter muscles and a series of linked biological hearts that beat with a slow, powerful rhythm. One end of a conduit attached itself to a capillary spine on the surface of the dead world, forming a perfect sealed connection. The other end, guided by smaller symbiote creatures, began its slow journey across millions of kilometers of empty space. Its target was a barren, rocky moon in orbit of Scylla Secundus. Lord Admiral Kalen watched on his own view screen as the first of these cosmic umbilicals stretched taut across the void, a fleshy, pulsating bridge between worlds. Then the pumping began. The seismic hearts of the conduit throbbed, and through its translucent membrane, Kalen could see the thick gray slurry of a consumed world being drawn from Scylla Tertius, a slow, viscous river of death flowing through the heart of space itself. The hive mind was not just storing biomass, it was creating a circulatory system on an astronomical scale, a network of arteries and veins that would connect its larder worlds, allowing it to move its fuel reserves wherever they were needed. This was the grand strategy. This was the fortress of flesh. Hive Fleet Thanatos was not here to conquer the sector. It was here to disassemble it and rebuild it into a fortified supply depot. Each planet was a future storehouse, each moon a potential anchor point, each asteroid belt raw material for kinetic munitions. The psychic lament of the Mater Lacrimarum intensified across the system, a palpable wave of sorrow for the necessity of this desecration. It was a grief that only deepened the horror for the human minds that felt it. They were not being destroyed in a blaze of hateful glory. They were being repurposed, their existence rendered down to its base components to fuel a war they could not comprehend against an enemy they could not see. Their entire reality was being methodically, tragically, and completely unmade. The Scylla anomaly was a triptych of imperial power, and its central panel was Sanctum Prime. While its sister worlds fed the sector and forged its arms, Sanctum Prime was its soul, a cardinal world of the highest sanctity. Its surface was a single planet-spanning ecclesiarchy complex. Spires of Gothic architecture clawed the heavens, so densely packed that in many districts the original ground level was a myth lost to centuries of construction. 200 billion souls inhabited this world, their lives a constant fervent prayer to the God Emperor. Pilgrims flocked here from across the segmentum, seeking solace and miracles beneath the shadows of its continent-sized cathedrals. It was a world of faith, a bastion of spiritual light that shone like a beacon in the warp. But to the cold, pragmatic consciousness of the hive mind, this light was irrelevant. What mattered was the number. 200 billion souls, 200 billion bodies, a reservoir of phosphates, proteins, and raw genetic data of almost unparalleled richness. In the grim calculus of the Mater Lacrimarum, Sanctum Prime was not a holy world. It was a tithe, a tax of blood and bone to be paid to the coming war. After the methodical vivisection of Scylla Tertius, the hive mind turned its full, sorrowful attention to the system's spiritual heart. The approach was once again a masterpiece of cold, calculated terror. The kinetic bombardment ceased. The skirmishes at the edge of the shattered Aegis line fell silent. For a full solar cycle, an unnerving peace settled over the system. Battlefleet Pacificus, what remained of it, used the respite to regroup, to lick its wounds and wonder at the enemy's intent. Lord Admiral Kalen, his certainty shattered, could only watch and wait, the silence more terrifying than any attack. The assault on Sanctum Prime began not with a physical attack, but a psychic one of such magnitude that it dwarfed all that had come before. The Mater Lacrimarum focused the entirety of her grief, the distilled despair of 1 billion lost years, upon the single point of Sanctum Prime's immense faith. It was a wave of absolute soul-crushing sorrow. It was not the chaotic rage of a demon or the seductive whisper of a heretic. It was the pure crystalline agony of a creator mourning a stillborn universe. Across the planet, the effect was apocalyptic. The faith that had been the world's shield became its conduit for damnation. In the grand cathedral of the Emperor's Ascension, Cardinal Militant Evandus was in the middle of a sermon, his voice amplified to reach the 10 million faithful packed into the nave. When the psychic wave hit, his words of hope and deliverance choked in his throat. He looked out upon the sea of faces and saw not the glory of the Imperium, but the faces of the dead. He felt the collective psychic death scream of every species the hive mind had ever consumed. He collapsed upon the pulpit, his mind shattered, weeping for the sins of a Xenos. God, this spiritual plague swept across the planet. Priests forgot the words to their liturgies, their minds filled with the futility of all existence. The sisters of battle, their faith a burning fire, suddenly felt that fire extinguished, replaced by a cold, empty void where the Emperor's light had once been. They dropped their bolters, their expressions vacant, their purpose annihilated. The 200 billion souls of Sanctum Prime were drowned in a sea of vicarious grief. Suicide became an epidemic. Riots born of sheer nihilistic despair erupted in the lower hives. The planet's soul was broken before the first Tyranid warrior made planetfall. Then came the swarms. They did not land in spores or drop pods. They came on the wind. The re-engineered atmosphere of Scylla Tertius, now a thick, soupy nutrient fog, was pushed by vast Tyranid bioconstructs towards Sanctum Prime. Born on these unnatural currents were trillions upon trillions of winged gargoyles and harpies, their numbers so great they formed a second living sky. They blotted out the light of the trinary suns, plunging the cardinal world into a premature, terrifying twilight. The planetary defense lasers, their crews, already half mad with despair, fired into the living clouds. Their beams carved incandescent channels through the swarm, vaporizing millions of creatures in an instant. But it was like trying to empty an ocean with the bucket. For every million that died, 10 million more swooped down to take their place. They were not aiming for military targets. They swarmed the vast plazas, the pilgrim encampments, the residential spires. It was not an invasion. It was a harvest of flesh. On the ground, what remained of the Astra Militarum and Adeptus Sororitas garrisons fought with the courage of the damned. They set up overlapping fields of fire in the grand avenues between cathedrals, their heavy bolters turning the approaching swarms into a red mist. But the tide was endless. The bodies of the slain Tyranids piled up, creating grisly ramps that allowed the next wave to swarm over the barricades. The battle was not one of tactics, but of ammunition expenditure. And the Imperium's supply was finite. The true horror began when the larger organisms arrived. Lictors, adapted for urban environments, scaled the cathedral walls, their chameleonic skin mimicking the stained glass windows as they hunted down pockets of resistance. Trigons burst from the ancient crypts beneath the basilicas, their seismic roars shattering foundations and bringing millennia of sacred architecture crashing down upon the defenders. And at the heart of the largest plazas, the Norn emissaries made their appearance. These were not mere killing machines. They were the physical avatars of the Mater Lacrimarum's will, their synaptic control so potent that the despair they radiated was a tangible force, causing nearby defenders to suffer cerebral hemorrhages or simply fall to their knees, catatonic with grief in The sanctum of the martyred saint, a small contingent of sororitas led by Canoness Viridia, held out for 3 days. They turned the hallowed halls into a fortress of faith and fire. But they were not defeated by claw or fang. They were defeated by the psychic echo of the hive mind's purpose. As they fought, they began to experience visions. They saw not a ravenous monster, but a desperate, fleeing god. They felt the cold touch of the great silence, the hunter in the void. They understood in a flash of heretical, unbearable clarity the Tyranid's purpose. Their faith could not withstand this terrible truth. They were not dying for an emperor who protected them, but were being sacrificed as fuel by one horror to fight another. One by one, their inner flame went out. Canoness Viridia was the last to fall, not to a Tyranid blade, but to the crushing weight of this appalling revelation, her own power sword slipping from her grasp as she sank to the floor, her purpose undone. The consumption of Sanctum Prime was a solemn affair. There was no screeching bestial frenzy. The bioforms worked with the grim efficiency of undertakers. Reclamation pools were established in the ruined naves of cathedrals, where the bodies of the fallen, both human and Tyranid, were rendered down into raw biomass. The spires of faith were pulled down, their stone and plasteel ground into dust to be absorbed and repurposed. The hive mind absorbed it all, the flesh, the bone, the memories, the faith, the despair. The 200 billion lives of Sanctum Prime became another layer of scar tissue on the soul of the Mater Lacrimarum, another drop of fuel in the tank, another agonizing but necessary sacrifice on the altar of a war that made their entire existence a tragic, pointless footnote. The tithe of sorrows had been paid in full in the silent, swirling heart of Hive Fleet. Thanatos, suspended in an amniotic ocean the size of a terrestrial sea, rested the Mater Lacrimarum. She was the nexus of the fleet, the Norn Queen Primus, a being whose physical form was both a metaphor and a terrifying reality. To call her a creature was a profound understatement. Her body, if such a term could apply, was a continent of iridescent flesh and pulsating neural ganglia, anchored to the very core of the flagship biovessel, a ship so vast it had its own gravitational field. She was not in the ship. She was the ship. Her thoughts were its corridors, her will its engine, her sorrow its shield. She was impossibly ancient. Her consciousness was a direct, unbroken lineage from the first moment the hive mind attained self-awareness in a galaxy long since erased from existence. She was a living library of extinction, a reliquary of cosmic grief. Contained within her genetic memory were the final psychic death cries of 10,000 sentient species, the silent screams of 100,000 worlds stripped bare, the echoing terror of a home galaxy devoured not by her children, but by the formless final predator that hunted them still. Each act of consumption, each necessary harvest, added another layer to this burden. The psychic resonance of the 200 billion souls from Sanctum Prime now washed through her, not as a triumphant feast in the way a lesser hive mind might experience it, but as a fresh tide of agony. She felt their faith curdle into despair, their hopes turn to ash, and she absorbed it all, adding their unique note of tragedy to her eternal requiem. This was her curse and her purpose, to feel the pain of all that she unmade, to serve as the conscience of the devourer. Her physical form was a landscape of sorrow. Vast crystalline tear ducts, larger than imperial cruisers, weeped a constant slow stream of nutrient-rich fluid that circulated throughout the vessel, carrying her genetic instructions and psychic commands. Her primary synaptic nodes were not horns or bony crests, but immense willow-like structures of nerve fiber that drifted in the amniotic fluid, their tips glowing with a soft, mournful luminescence. It was through these that she projected her will, a will not of hunger, but of desperate, pragmatic necessity. The Imperium, in its ignorance, would see her as a queen, a ruler, a progenitor. She was none of these things. She was a weapons guidance system, a memory bank, and a priestess presiding over an endless funeral. Her awareness was a constant agonizing balancing act. With one part of her mind, she processed the tactical data from the Scylla anomaly, directing the flow of biomass from the larder worlds, calculating the optimal trajectories for the next wave of kinetic strikes, and designing new bioforms from the genetic slurry of the fallen defenders. With another larger part, she maintained the great psychic ward, a projection of focused despair that shielded her fleet from conventional astropathic detection and corroded the morale of her foes. But the largest part of her consciousness was always turned outwards, away from the glittering prize of the Milky Way, towards the absolute crushing darkness of the intergalactic void. She was the lookout in the crow's nest of a ship sailing on an ocean of night. She listened, not with ears, but with the entirety of her psychic being, for the one signal she dreaded above all others. She listened for the silence. The great silence, the true devourer, was a concept that had no name in the hive mind's lexicon, only a feeling. It was the psychic equivalent of a hole in reality, a patch of existence with a background hum of life, of energy, of being itself. Simply was not. It was a creeping negation, a slow-moving wave of absolute metaphysical entropy. To be touched by it was not to die, but to be retroactively erased, your past, present, and future consumed by a perfect and eternal nothingness. She had seen it happen. She had felt the moment her home galaxy had finally winked out of existence, not in a bang, but in a final perfect silence that had ripped a hole in the hive mind's gestalt soul. This terror was the engine that drove her. Every world consumed, every species rendered down, was an act of defiance against that final quiet. Biomass was not food, it was ammunition. It was the raw material needed to create beings of such immense psychic potential that they could, for a fleeting moment, scream loud enough to hold back the silence. It was the fuel to create a fortress of life so dense and vibrant that its very existence was anathema to the encroaching void. This was her sacred, terrible duty, to build a god of flesh and agony, to stand against a god of emptiness and peace. The Mater Lacrimarum shifted her focus back to the immediate conflict. The imperial forces were reeling, but they were not broken. Long-range sensors detected the imminent arrival of a massive relief fleet, a crusade of retribution dispatched by the Imperium's revitalized leadership. They were coming with fire and fury, their minds shielded by a faith far more militant and less brittle than that of Sanctum Prime's pilgrims. Her psychic sorrow would be less effective against these new warriors. A different approach was needed. From the deepest recesses of her body, she began the process of creation. She drew upon the genetic material of the fallen Astartes and Sororias from Sanctum Prime, analyzing their unique biological resilience, their capacity for zealous hatred. She combined this with templates from her own memory, from warriors of a dozen other consumed galaxies who had shown similar traits. A new organism was required, not a brute force killer like a Carnifex, nor a subtle infiltrator like a Lictor. She needed a leader, a synaptic beacon that could not only command the swarms, but could understand and counter the specific tactical doctrines of the Adeptus. Astartes, within a specialized birthing sac, the size of a cathedral, the new creature began to take shape. It was a synthesis of Tyranid efficiency and human tactical acumen, a hive tyrant born not just of biomass but of battlefield experience absorbed from the minds of the dead. Its mind would be a direct conduit to her own, but it would be given a greater degree of autonomy than any Tyranid creature before it. It would be a general to lead her armies, a weapon forged in the image of the enemy. She would call this new lineage the Praetorians, and their purpose would be to meet the Imperium's finest warriors on their own terms, to break their strategy, their spirit, and then their bodies. As the Praetorian tyrant gestated, the Mater Lacrimarum felt the flicker of something that was almost hope. It was a cold, pragmatic thing, the hope of an engineer who believes her new design might withstand the coming storm, but it was immediately overshadowed by the ever-present grief. For she knew that every victory here, every brilliant new creation, was just one more sandbag on a levee that was destined, eventually, to break. The silence was coming, and all the harvested galaxies in the universe might not be enough to stop it. News of the Scylla anomaly's fall did not travel through the Imperium as a clear astropathic message, but as a psychic shockwave of despair. It was a void where a bastion of faith had once stood, a sudden silence that screamed of catastrophe. On Macragge, in the heart of the newly forged realm of Ultramar, Lord Commander Robut Gilliman received the fragmented reports with a heavy heart. The returned Primarch, burdened by the governance of 1,000,000 worlds and the prosecution of a galaxy-spanning war, saw the Tyranid attack not merely as a territorial loss, but as an existential threat of a new and horrifying kind. The accounts pieced together from the terrified whispers of refugee ship captains and the maddened visions of choir astropaths spoke of a Tyranid fleet that fought with the cold logic of an iron warrior and the patience of a glacier. This was an evolution, a terrifying apotheosis of the great devourer, and it could not be allowed to consolidate its gains. From the roster of the Indomitus Crusade, a new battle group was formed, designated Retribution Fleet Tertius. Its scale was monumental, a testament to the revitalized might of the Imperium. At its core were 3 full chapters of Primaris Space Marines, the staunch Ultramarines' Second Company, the ferociously aggressive Imperial Fist's 4th Company, and the stoic Iron Hands clan Raukayan. They were led by Sicarius, captain of the 2nd, a warrior reborn from the brink of death, his legendary bravado now tempered by a grim, cold focus. His flagship, the Victrix Honor, a magnificent vessel that had tasted victory at Guilliman's own side, would be the spearhead of the Imperium's wrath. Supporting this Astartes vanguard was a fleet that could conquer a subsector on its own. 24 battle barges and strike cruisers, 100 escort squadrons from the Imperial Navy, and the colossal might of 4 Mars-class battle cruisers. Most importantly, the fleet was accompanied by a full Titan legion, the Legio Invicta, their gargantuan transport ships dwarfing even the Astartes' capital ships. This was not a relief force. It was an instrument of annihilation. Guilliman's orders to Captain Sicarius were simple and absolute. Scour the Scylla anomaly of the Xenos' presence. Break its fleet. Purge its larder worlds. Leave nothing behind but scorched rock and righteous fury. The journey to the edge of the beleaguered sector was a grim affair. The psychic despair projected by the Mater Lacrimarum was a constant pressure even at this distance, a cloying fog in the minds of the fleet's navigators and astropaths. The Astartes, with their iron-willed mental conditioning, were largely immune, but they could see the effect on the mortal crews. Men wept for no reason, discipline frayed at the edges, and a pervasive sense of futility settled over the fleet. Sicarius, ever the pragmatist, ordered the chaplains to redouble their litanies, the ship commissars to be extra vigilant. The enemy was already fighting them, not with ships, but with sorrow. When Retribution Fleet Tertius translated from the warp at the system's edge, they were greeted by a scene of ordered desecration. The shattered remains of the Aegis line drifted in silent testament to Battlefleet Pacificus's defeat. The once verdant world of Scylla Tertius was a gray, hollowed-out orb, connected by a monstrous fleshy artery to a nearby moon. The system's trinary suns cast a pallid, sickly light through the aerosolized atmosphere that now filled the void. It was a vision of hell, not of fire and brimstone, but of cold industrial consumption. The hive mind was not surprised. The Mater Lacrimarum had felt the approach of this new, powerful consciousness for weeks. The Retribution Fleet's psychic signature was a beacon of disciplined aggression, a stark contrast to the brittle faith of the Cardinal World's defenders. She had prepared. The swarms were recalled from the surfaces of the captured worlds. The great processor ships ceased their work, and the main body of Hive Fleet Thanatos moved to form a defensive screen, a layered wall of chitin and bioplasma. At the forefront of this formation were the new creations, the Praetorian tyrants, their minds sharp, their purpose clear, their connection to the Mater Lacrimarum a perfect conduit of her will. Sicarius did not hesitate. His strategy was classic, brutal, and direct, a textbook application of the Codex Astartes. The fleet would advance in a spearhead formation, the Victrix Honor at its tip, using its overwhelming firepower to punch a hole directly through the center of the Tyranid fleet. The Astartes strike cruisers would then peel off, flanking the enemy and creating a kill box, while the slower, heavier Imperial Navy ships would pour in behind to annihilate the trapped Xenos. It was a strategy that had broken Orc Wagishes and shattered Chaos fleets. The opening salvo from the Retribution fleet was a sight of terrible glory. Thousands of lance batteries fired as one, their beams converging on the lead Tyranid bioships. Torpedoes, each armed with a Melta warhead capable of cracking a continent, streaked across the void. The sheer weight of fire was apocalyptic. The first wave of Tyranid vessels, mostly smaller vanguard organisms, were simply erased from existence, their flesh and chitin sublimated into superheated gas. But the hive mind did not flinch. This was anticipated. This was planned for. The second layer of the Tyranid fleet revealed itself. These were not ships, but colossal asteroid-like spores, their outer shells meters thick with ablative armor grown from the silicate-rich rock of the system's asteroid belt. They absorbed the Imperial barrage, their surfaces cracking and glowing cherry red, but their core integrity held. As the Imperial fleet plunged deeper, confident in their initial success, these spores burst open. They did not release swarms of fighters. They released a cloud of biological minds, each one a creature that actively hunted the energy signatures of the Imperial ships. And they unleashed something new. Creatures Sicarius's tactical display identified as void worms. These were immense serpentine organisms, hundreds of kilometers long, their bodies shimmering with powerful bioelectric fields. They did not attack with tooth and claw, but with their very forms. They coiled around the Imperial battle cruisers, their bodies acting as massive conductors, shorting out void shields and crippling power systems. The advance of the Imperial spearhead slowed, bogged down in a morass of mines and gigantic constricting monsters. It was then that the Praetorian tyrants led the counterattack. They did not lead a mindless charge. They moved with the coordinated precision of an Astartes strike force. One group of tyrants, leading swarms of specialized gargoyles with acid-spitting capabilities, targeted the lance turrets of the Imperial ships, blinding the fleet's long-range firepower. Another group, flanked by psychic zoanthropes, formed a synaptic node that focused their power, projecting a targeted psychic lance that overloaded the bridge of the Imperial Fist's battle barge, the Blade of Dorn, killing its captain and throwing the ship's command into chaos. Aboard the Victrix Honor, Sicarius watched his perfect textbook assault crumble into a chaotic close-range brawl. His tactical genius, honed on 100 battlefields, was being met and countered by an alien intelligence that seemed to anticipate his every move. He saw a squadron of ultramarine thunderhawks launched aboard a hive ship, being intercepted not by winged Tyranids, but by a swarm of creatures that spat a sticky, resinous substance, gumming up their engines and sending them spinning into the void. This was not a battle against a force of nature. This was a battle against a rival general, one whose troops were flesh, and whose strategy was born from the grief of a dying universe. The cataclysmic naval battle for the Scylla anomaly had just begun, and for the first time since his rebirth, Captain Cato Sicarius felt the cold, unfamiliar touch of doubt. The battle for the Scylla anomaly had devolved into a grinding, brutal war of attrition, a celestial siege where void shields were the fortress walls and torpedo salvos were the artillery. Aboard the Victrix Honor, Captain Sicarius directed the Retribution fleet with the cold precision of a master duelist. He had abandoned his initial grandiose strategy for a series of smaller, focused strikes, targeting the Tyranid's strange new support vessels, the colossal void worms and the mine-laying spores. Casualties were heavy. The Imperial Fist's strike cruiser, Stonewall, had been lost, its hull cracked open by a pincer movement of 2 hive ships. The Iron Hands had lost nearly half their escort squadrons. Yet for every Imperial ship lost, 3 Tyranid vessels were turned into drifting, frozen carcasses. They were winning, but it was a victory measured in meters of void gained and barrels of ammunition expended. Within the Gestalt consciousness of Hive Fleet Thanatos, the Mater Lacrimarum felt these losses not as a commander losing units, but as a body suffering wounds. Each death was a pinprick of pain in her vast awareness, a drain on the precious, irreplaceable biomass she had fought so hard to accumulate. But the pain was tolerable, a necessary cost. Her Praetorian tyrants were performing flawlessly, adapting to the Astartes' tactics, sacrificing lesser broods to draw the Imperial ships into carefully prepared ambushes. She was holding the line, buying time for the larder worlds to complete their transformation. Her grand, sorrowful strategy was unfolding as planned. And then it came. It was not a sound nor a psychic scream. It was not a vision or an energy wave. It was a presence defined by its absolute absence. On the far, cold edge of the galaxy, a whisper of the great silence brushed against the material universe. For the Mater Lacrimarum, it was a sensation of pure ontological horror, a vast swath of the hive mind's peripheral consciousness, the part that stretched thin across the interstellar void, simply stopped. It was not destroyed or jammed. It ceased to have ever existed. A hole had been punched in the fabric of her being, a wound of perfect nothingness. The symphony of a trillion minds suddenly contained a chord of absolute deafening silence. It was the psychic echo of a final, irrevocable end, the feeling of a god discovering it was mortal after all. The shockwave of this non-event radiated through her synaptic web, but it did not manifest as panic in the lesser bioforms. Their minds were too simple to comprehend such a metaphysical violation. But her most advanced, most sensitive creations, her masterpieces of biological warfare, felt it with the full force of her own terror. The Praetorian tyrants, their minds a perfect blend of alien calculation and absorbed human ingenuity, were the first to break. On the fleet's left flank, the Praetorian, designated as Tyrant Alpha Primus, was in the process of coordinating a brilliant counter-assault against the Iron Hands. Its synaptic commands were flowing, precise and lethal. In 1 nanosecond it was a general. In the next, its connection to the Mater Lacrimarum, its anchor to purpose and reason, was severed by that wave of absolute nullity. For a timeless instant, it was utterly alone, adrift in a sea of terrifying meaninglessness. When the connection to the greater hive mind snapped back into place, it was irrevocably corrupted. The Praetorian was no longer a soldier in a desperate war for survival. It was now a prophet of the void it had just touched. The logic of the Mater Lacrimarum, stockpile, prepare, resist, was inverted into a new, terrifyingly simple creed. All is lost. The silence is inevitable. Nothing has purpose. Therefore consume. There is only the hunger of the now. From the bridge of his battle barge, Clan Commander Boar of the Iron Hands watched in utter disbelief. The lead hive tyrant, a truly magnificent beast that had been outmaneuvering his forces for hours, suddenly halted its attack. It turned its 4 bone sabers not on the clan Rockin' cruisers, but on the very Carnifex brood it was leading. It dismembered them with a savage, pointless fury, its movements no longer precise, but jerky, frenzied. Then it opened its synaptic channels and broadcast its new nihilistic gospel. It was not a message of sorrow like the Mater Lacrimarum's, but a screech of pure, ecstatic despair. The psychic virus spread with horrifying speed through the most advanced nodes of the command structure. Other Praetorians, reeling from the same touch of the void, latched onto this new, simpler purpose. A synaptic schism tore through the fleet. The carefully orchestrated battle plan dissolved into anarchic, fratricidal chaos. A squadron of harpies, moments from beginning a strafing run on the Victrix Honor, suddenly turned on each other, tearing their wing membranes and sending themselves spiraling into the void in a suicidal dogfight. One of the colossal processor ships, a key component of the biomass refining operation, was suddenly assaulted by its own escorting hive ships, its soft, vulnerable sacs ripped open, spilling trillions of gallons of nutrient slurry into space like the entrails of a disemboweled god. The Mater Lacrimarum experienced this as a form of cerebral seizure. It was a nightmare made real. Her own limbs were attacking her, her own thoughts turning to poison. She felt the death of every loyal bioform cut down by its corrupted brethren. She felt the confusion and terror of the lesser swarms as their synaptic imperatives were contradicted, as their leaders turned on them with mindless ferocity. The psychic network that was her very being became a cacophony of shrieking madness and loyalist agony. The carefully woven tapestry of her fleet was being unraveled thread by thread from the inside out. Captain Sicarius saw the unfolding madness and could not process it. What in the Emperor's name are they doing? He demanded of his tactical officers. The displays showed Tyranid heat signatures turning on each other, bioships firing on their own kind. The disciplined, intelligent enemy he had been fighting was gone, replaced by a self-devouring mob. A trick? His first officer ventured, his voice laced with uncertainty. No, Sicarius said, his eyes narrowed. This is not deception. This is a plague, a madness. He saw the opportunity, the gaping wound that had opened in the heart of the enemy fleet. The Tyranid formations were in utter disarray, their coordination shattered. All vessels, he commanded, his voice ringing with renewed absolute authority. Target the largest vessels, the ones that are being attacked by their own kind. Advance into the breach, full firepower. Leave nothing. The Mater Lacrimarum knew she had only moments. The Imperial fleet, seizing the advantage, was now plunging into the heart of her disorganized swarms. The schism was consuming her command structure faster than the Imperials could. She had to perform an act of brutal, agonizing self-mutilation. Focusing her will, she identified the corrupted synaptic nodes, the Praetorian tyrants and all the lesser synapses creatures they had infected. Then, with a single focused pulse of psychic power, she executed them. She sent a wave of pure, overwhelming command through the network, a command that simply instructed their advanced neural systems to cease functioning. Across the battlefield, dozens of hive tyrants and hundreds of Tyranid warriors convulsed and went limp, their minds snuffed out by their own creator. The psychic backlash was immense, a wave of death pain that caused the Mater Lacrimarum's physical form to shudder, sending tremors through the entire flagship. But it worked. The nihilistic creed was silenced. The fratricide stopped, but the cost was catastrophic. Her elite command cadre was gone. Her fleet was in chaos, its formation shattered, and the full might of the Indomitus Crusade's retribution was now bearing down on its exposed, vulnerable heart. The first touch of the Great Silence had cost her more than the entire Imperial fleet combined. The synaptic schism had been cauterized, but the wound it left upon the consciousness of Hive Fleet Thanatos was deep and festering. The Mater Lacrimarum had been forced to purge her own generals, a desperate act of self-harm that left her fleet leaderless and reeling. The battlefield, once a carefully managed chessboard, had become a chaotic slaughterhouse. Lesser bioforms, their synaptic control severed, either reverted to instinctual predatory behavior or drifted aimlessly, easy targets for the disciplined gunnery of the Imperial fleet. The cold, calculated sorrow that had been her psychic weapon was now fractured, interspersed with spikes of her own acute agony and the lingering nihilistic echoes of the corrupted Praetorians. The cost of this war was becoming a weight that threatened to crush even her ancient, indomitable will. Every loss was tallied in the ledger of despair. Each Tyranid warrior that sublimated under the fire of a lance strike was not just a lost soldier, it was a carefully gathered quantum of carbon and protein, a measure of biomass that could have been used to birth the creature to fight the great silence now expended against these noisy, fleeting primates. Each drop of spilt ichor was a measure of fuel wasted, a reduction in the potential energy needed for the final hopeless battle. She experienced the agony of harvest on a scale no mortal mind could comprehend. It was a constant, multi-layered torment. There was the immediate physical pain of her children dying in the void, a million pinpricks of fire across her gestalt awareness. But beneath that was a deeper, more profound anguish. As the reclamation ships and processor vessels were targeted and destroyed by the relentless Imperial advance, she felt the loss of the harvested worlds. The essence of Scylla Tertius, the 200 billion souls of Sanctum Prime, all the carefully gathered and refined biomass, was now being violently dispersed into the void. It was like watching a library of irreplaceable knowledge burn. Each exploding bioship was a memory erased, a hope extinguished. Her perspective transcended the immediate conflict. She saw time not as a linear progression, but as a tapestry of cause and effect. The Imperial shells that tore through her fleet were not just destroying her present, they were crippling her future. She could feel the potential bioforms that would now never be born. She could sense the psychic screams that would not be available to hurl against the coming silence. The Imperium, in its blind, furious defense of its territory, was actively dismantling the only weapon in the galaxy that stood a chance of delaying the final end. They were, in their ignorance, the harbingers of their own utter annihilation, and the irony was a bitter acid in the soul of the hive mind. This calculus of agony informed every decision. As the Victrix Honor led a charge towards her own flagship, she did not meet it with her most powerful remaining beasts. 2. Risk a dominatrix or a hierophant, creatures that represented vast investments of biomass, was a tactical profligacy she could not afford. Instead, she threw waves of termagants and hormagaunts in their path. She sacrificed them by the billion. Their lives were cheap, their creation a simple and efficient process. She sent them forth not to win, but to die, to clog the guns of the enemy with their own bodies, to force the Imperial fleet to expend precious energy and ammunition on the most disposable of her children. The void became a charnel house. The sheer mass of termagant corpses formed a physical barrier, a gruesome floating reef of chitin and flesh. Imperial ships had to use their forward batteries simply to clear a path through the biological debris. The Mater Lacrimarum felt every one of these deaths, a dull, monotonous ache, the psychic equivalent of grinding stone. It was a wasteful, inefficient way to fight, a strategy of last resort, and it grieved her to her core. The agony was not just in the expenditure of her own forces, but in the absorption of the enemy's. When a damaged Imperial cruiser was finally overwhelmed, its crew consumed, she did not feel the triumph of a predator. She felt the despair of the dying crew, the psychic residue of their defiance and terror. She absorbed their knowledge, their memories, their emotions, and it was all so tragically useless for her true purpose. Their courage was admirable, but it was the courage of mayflies railing against a hurricane. Their faith in their corpse emperor was a powerful psychic force, but it was a candle against the encroaching absolute zero of the great silence. She was harvesting a crop of beautiful, useless emotions, a bounty of spiritual fervor that had no place in the cold physics of the war to come. All this pain, all this death, all this struggle for a handful of genetic data and a few 100,000 tons of phosphates. The exchange rate was appalling. From his vantage point on the Veritas Obscura, Lord Inquisitor Vorn watched the unfolding battle with a sense of dawning, sickening horror. His specialized augurs were not just tracking ship movements, they were analyzing the flow of biomass. He saw the hive mind strategy not as a military plan, but as an economic one. He saw the deliberate sacrifice of low-value assets to protect high-value ones. He saw the desperate attempts by reclamation vessels to scoop up the frozen corpses of their own dead, a frantic effort to recycle every last scrap of matter. He saw an enemy that was not fighting for victory, but was trying to minimize its losses in a war it had been forced to wage. By the throne, he whispered, his voice trembling. It's not trying to win. It's trying to cut its losses and escape. We are not a threat to be eliminated. We are an unforeseen expense. The Mater Lacrimarum, feeling the relentless pressure of the imperial assault, feeling her reserves of precious biomass bleed away into the uncaring void, came to a grim conclusion. This sector, this entire arm of the galaxy, was too well defended, too costly to harvest. The tithe of sorrows paid at Sanctum Prime had been bought at too high a price. The Imperium was not a docile herd to be culled, but a nest of venomous insects that fought for every scrap of their territory with insane, suicidal ferocity. She could win here. She had no doubt of that. She could drown this retribution fleet in a tide of her children's bodies. But the cost would leave her crippled, her fleet a hollow shell, her great purpose undone. It was not worth it. A new plan was needed, a desperate high-risk gambit to acquire a vast, concentrated source of power in a single, decisive strike. Her sorrowful gaze turned away from the fires of the battle and towards a faint, shimmering psychic light far across the segmentum. It was an ancient, elegant, and powerful presence, the light of a craft world. The retreat was as methodical and unnerving as the initial assault. Hive Fleet Thanatos did not break and flee in disarray. It disengaged. Coordinated swarms of smaller bioforms executed precise, suicidal screening maneuvers, sacrificing themselves to shield the larger, more valuable processor ships and conduit vessels as they ponderously withdrew from the Scylla system. The kinetic asteroids, held in reserve in the outer system, were given their final commands. They were not aimed at the Imperial fleet, but at the system's primary star. One after another, the mountain-sized projectiles plunged into the churning photosphere, disrupting its magnetic fields and unleashing colossal solar flares that bathed the entire system in a blinding, sensor-scrambling storm of radiation. Under the cover of this celestial chaos, the Hive fleet vanished into the deep void, leaving behind a ruined system, a battered Imperial fleet, and a profound, unanswered question. Aboard the Victrix Honor, Captain Sicarius declared a victory. He had met the enemy, broken its assault, and driven it from Imperial space. The Scylla anomaly was secured. Yet, as he stood on his command deck, surveying the reports of his fleet's devastating losses, the victory felt hollow, incomplete. The enemy had not been shattered. It had simply left. It was the disquieting feeling of a swordsman who has driven his opponent from the dueling circle, only to realize his opponent was merely repositioning for a different kind of killing blow. Far out in the silent dark, the Mater Lacrimarum was already focused on her new objective. The battle against the Imperium had been a catastrophic miscalculation. She had underestimated their tenacity, their willingness to expend materiel and lives on a scale that bordered on the irrational. The biomass gained had been almost entirely offset by the biomass lost. The Fortress of Flesh strategy was too slow, too costly. She needed a new source of fuel, a qualitative leap in power that could justify the immense expenditure. She needed a weapon. Her ancient consciousness sifted through the psychic map of the galaxy, a tapestry woven from the stolen memories of 1 trillion consumed minds. She ignored the roaring furnace of orc empires and the cold, silent tombs of the Necrons. She sought a specific resonance, a psychic frequency of immense power, purity, and concentration. She found it in the shimmering transient light of the Eldari. Specifically, she found the psychic spore of Craftworld Imemor, known to the Imperium as a reclusive and technologically advanced craft world, famed for its mastery of graviton weaponry and its peerless titans. Imemor was a prize of unimaginable value. But the Mater Lacrimarum did not covet its technology or the flesh of its inhabitants. The Eldari were too few, their bodies too slight to offer any significant biomass. No, she sought the craft world's heart, its soul, the infinity circuit. From the absorbed memories of a long-dead inquisitor, she had learned the truth of these devices, a psychically resonant matrix of wraithbone that housed the souls of the craft world's dead, preserving them from the eternal hunger of she who thirsts. It was a shield, a sanctuary, a library of consciousness. But the Mater Lacrimarum saw it for what it truly was, a battery, a psychic capacitor containing the compressed, focused energy of trillions of Eldari souls accumulated over 10,000 years. It was the most potent concentration of psychic energy she had ever encountered in this galaxy, a power source that dwarfed even the spiritual inferno of Sanctum Prime. The plan that formed in her mind was a gambit of breathtaking audacity and sacrilege. She would not merely consume the craft world, she would capture it. She would breach the infinity circuit, not to devour the souls within, but to weaponize them. She would turn the Eldari's ultimate defense against damnation into a psychic megabomb, a focused detonation of soul fire powerful enough to scorch a hole in reality itself. Such a blast, if it could be controlled, could potentially erase the vanguard of the Great Silence from existence, buying her precious time. It was a desperate, horrifying plan, a perversion of an entire species' afterlife into a disposable munition. The grief this necessity caused her was a physical agony, a fresh wound upon her already scarred soul. The fleet, now a ghost of its former self, changed course. It moved with a new kind of stealth, not hiding its psychic presence, but altering it. The Mater Lacrimarum suppressed her overwhelming sorrow, cloaking the fleet's signature in a shroud of psychic static that mimicked the background noise of the void, a difficult and draining feat of immense control. She birthed new organisms for this singular purpose. Genostealers, their genetic codes subtly altered, were seeded onto rogue asteroids and drifting space hulks along Emamor's predicted path. These were not infiltrators designed to start cults. They were living beacons, their purpose to act as a network of synaptic relays, allowing the hive mind to get close without being detected by the craft world's peerless farseers. She also created the Breacher synapses, immense squid-like creatures whose heads were armored with layers of captured adamantium and ceramite, harvested from the wrecks in the Scylla system. Their primary weapon was not a biocannon, but a single, massive psychic drill, a focused mind lance designed to bore through the wraithbone hull of the craft world, and more importantly, through the psychic wards that protected its sacred core. The hunt for Emamor was a silent, patient affair. The craft world moved like a ghost ship through the webway, its path unpredictable. But the Mater Lacrimarum had time and a vast galaxy-spanning intelligence. Using her Genostealer beacons, she tracked the subtle real space disturbances that marked the craft world's transit points. For months, the shattered remnants of Hive Fleet Thanatos stalked their prey, a predator learning the migration patterns of a creature of light. Finally, the moment came. The farseers of Emamor, their minds occupied with prophecies of chaos incursions and the growing threat of the Necron dynasties, detected a flicker of psychic disturbance. They interpreted it as a warp squall, a minor anomaly. It was the moment the trap was sprung. The Hive Fleet emerged from its shroud of silence, not from one direction, but from all. The Genostealer beacons acted as anchors, allowing micro-fleets to emerge simultaneously around the craft world, a perfect sphere of encirclement. Before the Aeldari could even raise their shields, the assault began. It was not a wave of mindless bodies. It was a surgical strike. The Breacher synapses, protected by swarms of smaller organisms, acting as a blade of shielding, surged forward. They ignored the elegant Aeldari defense craft, their single-minded purpose driving them towards the craft world's hull. The Ghostwind Gambit was in motion. The hive mind was no longer hunting for flesh, but for souls, and it was willing to risk its own damnation to capture them. The assault on Emamor was a violation, an act of brutalist physics against ethereal artistry. The elegant solar sails of the craft world, woven from solidified light and psychic crystal, were torn asunder by crude, fleshy grapnels. Its graceful spires, which sang with the songs of the stars, were silenced by the impact of the Breacher synapses, whose armored heads struck the wraithbone hull with the percussive clang of 1,000 forge hammers. The Aeldari, for whom war was a tragic, intricate dance, found themselves locked in a horrifyingly intimate embrace with an entity that treated battle as a problem of biomechanics. Autarch Lyrizel, her heart a cold knot of dread, watched from the command dome of the Tower of the Resplendent Gaze. The skeins of fate, usually so clear to the farseers at her side, were a tangled, screaming mess. The suddenness and precision of the attack were things of nightmare. The enemy was not just around them, it was inside their defenses, its movements preempting their every countermeasure. She dispatched squadrons of vampire raiders and fleets of graceful aspect warrior craft. They fought with the sublime skill of their race, their shuriken cannons and bright lances carving intricate patterns of destruction through the swarms. But the Tyranids did not seem to care. They ignored the losses, their lesser organisms serving as a living shield for the colossal squid-like breachers that were now affixed to the craft world's hull. The psychic drills of the breacher synapses whined not with a physical sound, but with a mind-lacerating psychic frequency. They began to bore into the psychoconductive wraith bone, the sacred living material of the craft world itself. For the Eldari, this was an agony beyond reckoning. They felt the violation in their very souls, a deep resonant pain as the integrity of their home, their sanctuary, was compromised. The infinity circuit, the collective soul of their ancestors, pulsed with a wave of alarm, a chorus of silent, ethereal voices crying out in warning. The Mater Lacrimarum felt their pain and their fear, and it added yet another layer of torment to her own. She was desecrating a work of art, a thing of beauty, in a galaxy of brutal functionality, but the cold calculus of survival overrode all other considerations. Her will focused through the breachers, urging them on, their drills biting deeper, inch by agonizing inch, towards the craft world's central dome where the infinity circuit lay hidden. It was in this moment, at the zenith of this desperate, sacrilegious act, that the true enemy finally revealed its hand. There was no fleet, no creature, no warning. There was only the arrival of the echo of annihilation. Far beyond the orbit of the beleaguered craft world, a small, unremarkable star system hung in the void. It contained a dying red dwarf, 3 barren rock planets, and a sparse asteroid field. It was a place of no consequence, unrecorded on any star chart, home to nothing but cold ancient dust. In one moment it was there, in the next it was not. It did not explode, it did not implode. It simply ceased to be. The star, the planets, the asteroids, the very fabric of space they occupied were erased, not destroyed, but edited out of existence. Where the star system had been, there was now a patch of void that was unnaturally perfectly black. It did not reflect light. It did not radiate energy. It was a hole in the universe, a wound of absolute nothingness that was colder than the space around it. It was a manifestation of the great silence, a single exploratory tendril of the absolute nullity that pursued the hive mind across the void. The Mater Lacrimarum felt its arrival not as a psychic event, but as the sudden, total absence of one. A small portion of her galaxy-spanning awareness, the part that had passively registered the existence of that unremarkable star system, was now gone. The connection was not broken. The other end had simply ceased to exist. It was a feeling of cosmic amputation, of a limb vanishing from reality without pain or process, leaving only a perfect, impossible void. The terror that washed through her was a primal, foundational thing, the fear of a god discovering a power that could unmake it as if it had never been. This was the hunter. This was the end. Her grief, her sorrow, her grim purpose, all were dwarfed by this pure crystalline fear. It was not the fear of death, but the fear of non-existence, of utter and total erasure from the memory of the cosmos. The echo of this event washed over the battle for Imimor. The Aeldari felt it as a sudden, inexplicable chill in their souls, a fleeting vision of an empty universe where even their gods were naught but forgotten dust. For a second, the fighting faltered, both Tyranid and Aeldari stunned by this brush with a horror that transcended their ancient enmity. But for the Mater Lacrimarum, the moment of terror was also a moment of terrible confirmation. It was here. It had followed her. The long flight was over. This galaxy was no longer a refuge or a larder. It was the final battlefield. Her desperate gambit was no longer a strategic choice. It was the only possible path forward. Her will, now sharpened by sheer mind-breaking terror, slammed back into her forces with the force of a psychic tsunami. Faster! The silent command needed no words. The breacher synapses redoubled their efforts, their psychic drills glowing white-hot with focused mental energy. The wraith bone of the central dome began to crack, sending fissures of pure psychic pain through the entire craft world. The Aeldari defenders, shaking off the cosmic dread, renewed their assault with the fury of a dying species defending its soul. The battle for Imamor became a frantic, desperate race against a clock that ticked down to utter annihilation. The small patch of absolute blackness in the nearby system began to expand. It was not a rapid expansion, not an explosion, but a slow, inexorable creep, like a drop of perfect ink spreading across the page of reality. It was not coming for the craft world or the hive fleet. It was simply growing, its presence a declaration that this small corner of the universe had been marked for erasure. The Mater Lacrimarum knew she did not have hours. She had minutes. The universe held its breath. The farseers of Imamor saw the future not as a web of possibilities, but as a single blinding point of light, a detonation of the soul that would either be their salvation or their final absolute doom. Autarch Lyrasil, her face a mask of grim resolve, led the final desperate charge of the Wild Rider clans, their jet bikes weaving through the psychic chaos like streaks of lightning. They were no longer fighting to repel the invaders. They were fighting to die at the foot of their most sacred shrine, to give their own souls to its defense. The wraithbone dome of the Infinity Circuit shattered. Great iridescent shards, each containing the psychic echo of 1,000 Aeldari lives, drifted into the void. The breacher synapses, their task complete, pulled back, their psychic drills falling silent. Into the breach, a new creature flowed, a being designed for this singular, horrific purpose. It was the Psyche Vor, a sinuous serpent-like organism whose entire body was a single massive psychic siphon. It resembled a lamprey made of solidified grief, its maw a spiraling vortex of neural thorns and synaptic relays. It latched onto the exposed core of the Infinity Circuit, its flesh melding with the psychocrystalline matrix. The Mater Lacrimarum was no longer a general commanding an army. She was a surgeon performing an act of cosmic neurosurgery and a priestess committing the ultimate blasphemy. Through the Psyche Vor, she did not devour the souls within the circuit. She seized control of them. She felt the trillions of Aeldari spirits rise up against her, a chorus of ancient powerful minds screaming in violation. They were warriors, poets, artisans, and seers, a civilization's worth of consciousness. Against any other foe, they would have been an unbreakable psychic fortress. But the Mater Lacrimarum did not meet them with force. She met them with truth. She opened her own mind, her own soul, and showed them. She projected not an argument or a threat, but the pure, unvarnished memory of the great silence. She showed them the final, silent moments of her home galaxy. She let them feel the absolute soul-crushing terror of the encroaching nullity, the perfect final void that was even now creeping across the stars towards them. She showed them that their ancient enemy, she who thirsts, was but a hungry child compared to the silent, patient oblivion that was coming for them all. She offered them not a choice between servitude and freedom, but between a meaningful death and a pointless erasure. For a timeless moment, the psychic battle raged, a war of philosophies fought in an instant. The pride and fury of the Aeldari souls crashed against the immovable object of the hive mind's despair. And then a shift. The eldest and most powerful of the Aeldari souls, seers who had glimpsed fragments of this terrible truth in their own prophecies, understood. Their resistance did not cease, but it changed. It became a sad, terrible, willing surrender. Their scream of violation became a chorus of apocalyptic assent. They would allow their eternity to be used as a weapon, a final defiant cry against the encroaching silence. The Mater Lacrimarum, her connection to the Aeldari souls, now a perfect tragic harmony, began the final act. She turned the infinity circuit inside out. The device designed to draw psychic energy inwards, to shield and protect, was reconfigured to expel it all in a single, focused, directional blast. The energy of trillions of souls compressed over 10 millennia was gathered, shaped, and aimed. The target was not a ship or a fleet. The target was the patch of absolute nothingness that had consumed the nearby star system. The soul fire offensive was unleashed. From the heart of Craftworld Emimor, a beam of pure white gold energy erupted. It was not light. It was not radiation. It was existence itself, weaponized. It was the concentrated essence of a civilization's worth of life, love, art, and sorrow focused into a lance of pure being. The beam shot across the void, and where it passed, space-time itself seemed to sing. For the human crews of the distant Retribution fleet who witnessed the event on their long-range sensors, the energy reading was so impossible, so far beyond any scale they could measure, that it broke their machines. The astropaths who felt it did not die screaming. Their minds were simply filled with a single, perfect, musical chord of such sublime beauty that they would spend the rest of their lives in catatonic bliss. The lance of soul fire struck the edge of the encroaching nullity. The result was not an explosion. It was a paradox made manifest. A force of absolute existence collided with the force of absolute non-existence. For a moment, there was a perfect balance. A shimmering, incandescent wall of pure paradox hung in the void, a place where being and nothingness fought to a standstill. Then the soul fire won. The lance pushed the void back. The nothingness was not destroyed. It was unmade, its progress reversed. The beam scoured a vast corridor of real space, cauterizing the wound in the universe, pushing the influence of the great silence back out of the galaxy. It was a victory of impossible scale, a single blow that had saved a sliver of reality. But the cost was absolute. The detonation of the infinity circuit was an uncontrolled psychic apocalypse. Craftworld Emimor, its heart and soul expended, simply dissolved. The wraith bone sublimated into psychic dust, the elegant spires crumbling into memory. The few surviving Aeldari, their connection to their ancestors and their home severed, were left floating in the void, their minds shattered by the psychic backlash, their souls now truly lost. Hive Fleet Thanatos, positioned at the very epicenter of this psychic nova, was annihilated. The wave of pure existence energy that washed back from the detonation was as deadly to the Tyranids as it was to the void. The great bioships, the swarms, the conduit vessels, all were unmade, their complex biology torn apart by a force they were never meant to channel. The Psychivore, the Breachers, and the vast majority of the fleet were reduced to their component molecules and scattered across the now consecrated void, and in the local sector an even greater price was paid. The psychic shockwave of the Soul Fire offensive, powerful enough to repel an extragalactic horror, hit the Astronomicon. The light of the Emperor, the psychic beacon that guided all Imperial travel, was not just disrupted in the sector, it was snuffed out permanently. The entire region of space was plunged into a silent, impenetrable darkness, a new age of isolation and terror for the worlds within. The Imperium had lost a gateway to the stars, and they would never even know why. Silence, not the terrible absolute silence of the void, but a lesser, more mundane silence of exhaustion and death. In the aftermath of the Soulfire offensive, the space where the battle for Imamor had raged was preternaturally still. The psychic screaming had ceased, the thunder of Imperial guns was a distant memory, and the mournful hum of the hive mind was gone. There was only the quiet drift of cosmic dust, the glittering, iridescent remains of a vaporized craft world, and the frozen, silent carcasses of a shattered fleet. Hive Fleet Thanatos was no more. The name, the entity, the grand strategic purpose, all had been sacrificed on the altar of the Ghostwind Gambit. Of the continent-sized fleet that had so terrified the Imperium, only one vessel remained. It was the flagship, the living cathedral that housed the Mater Lacrimarum, and it was mortally wounded. Great gaping wounds had been torn in its chitinous hide, entire sections of its body scoured away by the raw power of the Eldari's soul fire. It drifted aimlessly, its bio-engines cold, its synaptic nodes flickering like dying embers. It was a god in its death throes, a leviathan beached on the shores of an empty, silent sea. Within the vast, now darkened amniotic chamber, the Mater Lacrimarum endured an agony that transcended the physical. She was a crippled god, her connection to the greater hive mind, the gestalt consciousness of all Tyranids in the galaxy, was severed. The psychic detonation had acted like a surgical blade, excising her and her shattered fleet from the whole. She was an island of consciousness in a sea of silence, alone for the first time in an eon. The constant symphony of a billion minds was gone, replaced by a solitude so profound it was a form of sensory deprivation. Worse than the loneliness was the wound in her soul. She had been the architect of the victory, but also the instrument of its appalling cost. She felt the ghosts of the trillions of Aeldari souls she had just expended. Their final willing sacrifice had burned itself into her memory, a permanent scar of nobility and sorrow. She had taken one of the galaxy's great wonders, a testament to life and memory, and turned it into a consumable. The grief of this act was a poison that coursed through her remaining psychic channels, a self-inflicted wound far deeper than any the Imperial fleet had managed to land. She was also blind. The sheer, overwhelming power of the soul fire had burned out her most sensitive psychic senses, the ones she used to peer across the void and feel the approach of the great silence. She had pushed it back, she knew that much. She had bought time, but she no longer knew how much. A day, a year, a millennium. She was a sentinel whose eyes had been put out, left to stand watch over a threat she could no longer perceive. Her physical fleet was a ruin of the billions of organisms that had followed her into this galaxy, only a handful of lesser creatures, dormant. Within the deepest recesses of her flagship's hull remained. Her larder worlds in the Scylla system were lost to her, cut off by the collapse of the Astronomicon and her own inability to project her will over such a distance. Her great reserves of biomass, the entire purpose of her campaign, were gone, either expended against the Imperium or vaporized alongside the craft world. She was a refugee once more, just as she had been when she first fled her home galaxy. But this time she was crippled, isolated, and adrift in hostile territory. From a safe, vast distance, the remnants of Retribution Fleet Tertius watched. Their sensors had been overwhelmed, their astropaths driven mad, but they had witnessed the impossible. They had seen the craft world and the Tyranid fleet annihilate each other in a flash of inexplicable energy. Captain Sicarius, his tactical mind unable to process the event in any logical framework, logged it as a mutual destruction of two Xenos forces, likely due to the detonation of some unforeseen Eldari superweapon. He recorded the permanent loss of the Astronomicon in the sector as a tragic but unrelated warp phenomenon. The true nature of the event, the scale of the threat that had been momentarily repulsed, was so far beyond his comprehension that it did not even register as a possibility. He ordered his battered fleet to withdraw, to report their hard-won victory in the Scylla anomaly, and to mourn the loss of this entire region of space to the darkness. The Imperium would record a triumph, blissfully unaware that they had been spectators at a battle for the very soul of their reality. The Mater Lacrimarum, feeling the withdrawal of the Imperial fleet as a faint, receding pressure, let her own consciousness begin to fade. There was nothing left to do but endure. Her flagship, now a little more than a tomb, began to follow the slow, inexorable pull of a nearby nebula, a vast cloud of cold gas and interstellar dust. It was a place to hide, a place to grieve, and perhaps a place to begin the slow, arduous, and likely hopeless task of healing. The victory had been achieved, a sliver of the galaxy had been saved. But the victor was broken, her army destroyed, and her godlike consciousness was now little more than a whisper of pain in the endless, lonely night. Lord Inquisitor Caelus Vorn stood before the Ordoxenos conclave of the Segmentum Pacificus, a solitary, grim figure in the center of a vast, tiered amphitheater. He was on the forbidden world of Ignathos, a place where only the highest echelons of the Inquisition were permitted to tread. Above him sat 100 Inquisitor lords, their faces impassive masks, their minds shielded behind layers of psychic wards and impenetrable dogma. The air was thick with the scent of ancient parchment and the cold, sterile tang of absolute authority. For 3 days, Vorn had been presenting his findings, his voice a steady, relentless torrent of data, pick captures, psychic resonance logs, and carefully reasoned, utterly heretical conclusions. He had laid it all out. The Tyranid fleet's methodical harvesting, not frenzied consumption. The industrial repurposing of entire worlds. The psychic signature of profound sorrow, not bestial hunger. The final impossible energy reading from the Emimor system, an event that defied all known physics. He connected every piece of evidence with the cold, unassailable logic that had made him the Ordo's most respected tyrannic war scholar. He presented his final terrifying thesis not as a theory, but as a proven fact. The great devourer is not the predator, he stated, his voice echoing in the cavernous chamber. It is the prey. Every world it consumes, every life it extinguishes, is not an act of malice, but of desperation. It is stockpiling biomass on a galactic scale, building a weapon of life to fight a war against an entity of absolute death, a horror from the outer dark that consumes existence itself. We witness not the destruction of a craft world, but the firing of a bullet made of souls that has momentarily driven back this greater, truer enemy. Hive Fleet Thanatos did not seek to conquer us. It sought to use us, our worlds, our very matter as ammunition. We are not the meal. We are the armory. A profound silence followed his words. It was not the silence of consideration, but the cold, heavy silence of judgment. The Inquisitor lords looked at one another, their thoughts passing between them on shielded psychic channels. What Vorn was proposing was more than just a new theory about Xenos motivation. It was a heresy that struck at the very foundations of imperial doctrine. Mankind was the pinnacle of creation, the chosen of the Emperor. The galaxy was their manifest destiny. The Xenos were a plague to be exterminated, a test of faith and a trial of arms. To suggest that humanity was merely a resource in a cosmic war far greater than its own struggles was to diminish mankind's place in the universe, to reduce the holy wars of the Imperium to a mere footnote in a Xenos drama, to suggest that the Tyranid, the ultimate embodiment of the alien threat, was in some twisted way acting as a shield against a greater darkness, was an obscenity of the highest order. It implied purpose, even a tragic nobility. To the ultimate monster, it was a truth the Imperium was structurally, dogmatically, and psychologically incapable of accepting. The verdict came from Lord Inquisitor Vex, a man so ancient his flesh had all but mummified around his agmetic skeleton. His voice was a dry, synthesized rasp. Lord Inquisitor Vorn, your service to the Ordo has been long and, until now, distinguished, but you have stared too long into the abyss. The mind of the Xenos is a labyrinth of lies, and you have lost your way within it. You have ascribed motive to the beast, empathy to the devourer, and reason to the apocalypse. You have allowed the alien to contaminate your perspective. Vex's voice hardened. Your theory is not just heresy, it is a spiritual poison. If it were to spread, what would become of the faith of the Imperial Guard, who must hold the line against the swarm? What would become of the righteous fury of the Astartes? To believe your words is to invite despair, to suggest that our eternal war is meaningless. It is to cede our place at the center of the cosmic struggle. It is a lie of the highest order, one that serves only the enemies of man by eroding the very will to fight. Vorn stood his ground. The truth does not require belief, my lord. It simply is. The evidence. Your evidence is a collection of anomalies that you have woven into a narrative of madness, another inquisitor interjected, his voice booming. You have forgotten the most fundamental precept of our order. The alien is unclean. The alien is unknowable. The alien must be purged. There is no other truth. The judgment was swift and unanimous. Lord Inquisitor Kalis Vorn was declared hereticus diabolus. His research was to be seized, sealed in the deepest stasis vaults of Ignathos, and struck from all records. His name was to be erased, his acolytes mind-wiped or executed. The official record would be amended. Hive Fleet Thanatos had been destroyed by the heroic actions of Retribution Fleet Tertius, its remnants scattered and insignificant. The loss of the Imimor craft world was a footnote, an unfortunate casualty. The darkening of the Astronomicon was an unrelated and tragic warp storm. The book was to be closed. But Vorn had anticipated this. For 50 years he had served the Inquisition, and he knew its dogmatic inertia better than anyone. He had not come to Ignathos to be vindicated. He had come to deliver a warning, and as a final contingency, to save his own life and the truth he now carried. As the first of the Conclave's guards moved to apprehend him, a hidden command rune on his person activated. On his lac ship, the Veritas Obscura, waiting in a high, lonely orbit, a pre-recorded message was broadcast on all Vox channels, its encryption codes bypassing the station's comms baffles. My name is Kalis Vorn. I am a Lord Inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos. I have seen the true face of the enemy, and it is not the Tyranid. I have seen the shape of the war to come. Do not trust the official record. Seek the truth in the silence between the stars. The devourer flees. The devourer flees. Before the broadcast could be shut down, a second command activated the ship's warp drive. The Geller field flared for a microsecond, just long enough to tear the ship apart in real space. The resulting explosion was not large, but it was enough to momentarily cripple the station's primary Auspex arrays. In the confusion, Vorn activated the one personal device the Conclave had not dared to remove from him, a phase field generator of archaeotech origin. His body shimmered and became intangible, and he slipped through the floor of the amphitheater, escaping into the labyrinthine service tunnels below. Kalis Vorn, the most knowledgeable man in the galaxy on the true nature of the Tyranid threat, was now a hunted man. He was a radical, a heretic, a ghost in the machine of the Imperium he had once served. His truth had been buried, his name condemned, but the warning had been sown, a single seed of doubt planted in the bedrock of imperial dogma. He was alone, friendless, and pursued by the most powerful organization in the galaxy, but he carried with him a burden of knowledge that could, if he could find a way to make it heard, be the last best hope for a galaxy determined to remain blind. In the cold, silent depths of the Ghoul Stars, where the light of the Astronomicon had never truly reached, the broken husk of the Tyranid flagship drifted into the heart of a vast, churning nebula. The cloud was a nursery of protostars and a graveyard of dead suns, a place of cosmic genesis and decay. Here, shielded from prying eyes by thick veils of hydrogen and interstellar dust, the Mater Lacrimarum began the long sleep. Her consciousness, once a continent of thought, had shrunk to a flickering ember. She was a god in a coma, her mind consumed by the twin agonies of her isolation and her Pyrrhic victory. The flagship, now more tomb than vessel, became her chrysalis. Its remaining autonomous systems, acting on the last vestiges of her will, began the slow, arduous process of repair and rebirth. Vast membranous fronds, like the leaves of a world tree, unfurled from the ship's hull. They stretched for thousands of kilometers, delicate and translucent, designed to catch the faint stellar winds and absorb the free-floating hydrogen and helium of the nebula. It was a slow, inefficient process, like trying to fill an ocean with a single drop of rain. The ship's damaged sections were sealed off with hardened resin, the dead biomass within put into a state of perfect preservation, too precious to be allowed to decay. The Mater Lacrimarum sleep was not a peaceful one. It was a purgatory of memory. She endlessly relived the final willing sacrifice of the Eldari, their psychic death song a permanent echo in her mind. She felt the cold, amputating touch of the great silence, a phantom limb that ached with the memory of non-existence. But most of all, she relived the schism, the moment her own children, her perfect creations, had turned on her. The psychic taint of their nihilistic madness was a poison she had to purge from her own being, a slow and agonizing process of mental self-purification. For centuries she drifted, the Imperium, having declared victory and suppressed Voron's heresy, turned its attention to other, more immediate threats. The Scylla anomaly, now cut off from the light of Terra, became a lost sector, a forgotten casualty in an endless war. The name of Hive Fleet Thanatos faded from the tactical readouts of the Segmentum Command, relegated to a historical footnote. The galaxy moved on, blissfully unaware of the slumbering, wounded intelligence hiding in its dark periphery. During this long hibernation, a slow change began. The handful of lesser organisms that had survived deep within the flagship's core, dormant ripper swarms, gestating biotitans and other nascent creatures, were slowly, carefully reabsorbed. Their biomass was broken down and repurposed, not to build new warriors, but to repair the Mater Lacrimarum herself. Her vast wounded brain was slowly rebuilt, her synaptic pathways regrown, her shattered consciousness painstakingly pieced back together. She was cannibalizing the last vestiges of her own army. To heal her mind, the process was brutally slow. After a century of absorption, she had gathered enough energy to birth a single small vanguard drone. It was sent out into the nebula, not to hunt, but to prospect. It sought out rogue planetoids, icy comets, and clouds of specific rare minerals. When it found them, it would implant a single spore, which would grow into a slow, patient mining organism, a creature that would spend decades digesting a rock to send a tiny trickle of refined matter back to the dormant flagship. The hive mind was no longer a devourer. It was a scavenger, a gleaner picking at the scraps of creation. The greatest task of the long sleep was not physical, but mental. The Mater Lacrimarum had to process her experience, to integrate the terrible lessons she had learned. The Ghostwind Gambit, for all its Pyrrhic success, was a weapon that could only be fired once. The Eldari were too few, their infinity circuits too rare and well defended. It was not a sustainable strategy. A new doctrine was required. She sifted through the genetic and psychic data she had absorbed from the Imperium. She analyzed their tenacity, their faith, their sheer, stubborn refusal to yield. She had seen it as a flaw, an inefficiency. Now she saw it as a potential strength. The psychic power of 200 billion humans on Sanctum Prime, though diffuse and uncontrolled compared to the Eldari, had been immense. If it could be harvested, focused, and weaponized in the same way as the Infinity Circuit, it could provide the ammunition she so desperately needed. A new, terrible purpose began to form in her slowly healing mind. The Imperium of Man was not just an obstacle or a source of biomass. It was the key. Its greatest strength, its sheer, overwhelming numbers, and the fanatical faith of its people was also its greatest vulnerability. She began to design new organisms, new strategies, not for open warfare, but for a different kind of harvest, a harvest of faith. She envisioned psychic resonators that could absorb and store the collective worship of a shrine world, parasitic organisms that could latch onto the ecclesiarchy's power structures, and synaptic creatures that could turn a preacher's sermon into a weaponized hymn of psychic despair. The long sleep was coming to an end. The wounds were beginning to scar over. The agony was hardening into resolve. Hive Fleet Thanatos was dead, but from its ashes something new and far more insidious was stirring. The Mater Lacrimarum had learned that you could not fight a god of nothingness with flesh and claw alone. You needed to fight it with belief. And in this galaxy there was no greater or more abundant source of belief than the teeming, worshipful, and tragically ignorant trillions of the Imperium of Man. The final state of the galaxy was one of triumphant, catastrophic ignorance. In the grand halls of the Senatorum Imperialis on Terra, the Scylla campaign was enshrined as a legendary victory, a textbook example of the Indomitus Crusade's righteous might. Captain Cato Sicarius, his name cleared of past shadows, was lauded as the hero who broke the back of a major Tyranid incursion, his tactical genius celebrated. The official histories recorded the utter destruction of Hive Fleet Thanatos, its unique strategies noted as a dangerous but ultimately failed mutation of the Xenos threat. The permanent darkening of the anomaly sector was decreed an unfortunate but acceptable price for securing the Segmentum Pacificus from the Great Devourer. A legacy of ash had been swept under the rug of imperial dogma. Lord Inquisitor Vorn, now a ghost, whispered about in the darkest corners of the Calixis sector, continued his lonely crusade. He became a legend of a different sort, a heretic boogeyman whose name was used to frighten over-curious acolytes. Yet his broadcast, though brief, had planted a seed. A handful of radical inquisitors, disillusioned Chartist captains, and rogue traders who had seen too much in the void began to quietly piece together the anomalies. They formed secret societies, whispering networks that shared forbidden data, always one step ahead of the Vexian purges. They were searching for a truth they could not yet name, drawn by the terrifying possibility that the Imperium's greatest enemy was not what it seemed. Vorn's heresy was not dead. It had become a cult, a dangerous counter-narrative to the comforting lies of the High Lords. But the true legacy of the war was not written in the history books of mankind, but in the silent gestalt consciousness of the hive mind itself. Before the Mater Lacrimarum's link to her brethren had been severed by the Soul Fire offensive, she had managed one final desperate act. In the instant of the psychic detonation, as her own fleet was being annihilated, she had flung a single compressed burst of information back into the collective consciousness. It was a psychic data shriek of unimaginable complexity, containing everything she had learned. It contained the memory of the Great Silence, the first concrete evidence of the true enemy shared amongst the entire Tyranid race. It contained the schematics of the Praetorian tyrants and the cold mathematical logic of kinetic bombardment. It contained the agonizing calculus of biomass expenditure, a lesson in efficiency learned in the fires of the Scylla anomaly. But most importantly, it contained the blueprint of the Ghostwind Gambit. It contained the forbidden knowledge of how to turn a species' collective soul into a weapon of galactic significance. Across the Milky Way, the advance of the other hive fleets began to subtly, almost imperceptibly change. The change was not immediate or uniform, but it was inexorable. Hive Fleet Leviathan, churning through the galactic core, began to alter its consumption patterns. It started to prioritize worlds with high populations over worlds rich in minerals. Shrine worlds and cardinal worlds, once targets of opportunity, became objectives of paramount strategic importance. New bioforms began to appear in its swarms, zoanthropes of immense psychic capacity, their skulls enlarged to act as living resonators, and lictor variants that did not just sow terror, but seemed to study and catalog the religious practices of their prey before the main invasion began. Hive Fleet Kraken, its splinter fleets regenerating in the dark spaces between the stars, began to show a new, unnerving patience. Its vanguard organisms no longer tested planetary defenses with brute force, but with insidious, morale-breaking psychic attacks that mirrored the sorrow plague of the Mater Lacrimarum. They were no longer just trying to find weaknesses in fortifications, but in the very faith of the defenders. Even the ancient slumbering behemoth of Hive Fleet Tiamat, long content to guard its mysterious constructions on the world of Zeophoria, began to stir. Its psychic presence in the galaxy shifted from a passive territorial hum to an active searching pulse, as if it were scanning for specific psychic frequencies, for other potential infinity circuits or spiritual nexuses of immense power. The galaxy was no longer just a meal to be devoured. The message of the Mater Lacrimarum had transformed it into something far more significant. It was now a chessboard, an arsenal, and a testing ground. Every imperial world was a potential power source. Every Aeldari craft world a potential doomsday weapon. Every species with a soul a potential bullet in the chamber of a gun being aimed at an enemy no one else could see. The final legacy of Hive Fleet Thanatos was a quiet, terrifying repurposing of the entire Tyranid race. The Devourer's hunger remained, but its purpose was now unified and horrifically clear. It would continue to consume the galaxy, stripping it of every last scrap of life and matter, but not for sustenance, not for evolution. It was forging the entire Milky Way into a single colossal weapon, a soul bomb of unimaginable scale, preparing to sacrifice a trillion lives in one final, glorious, and likely futile detonation against the silent, patient, and final darkness that was coming for them all. The war for the Scylla anomaly was over. The war for reality itself had just begun.